I'm Sarah Cooney. I'm the executive director. We're very excited to have you here today and to have Joyce Gold from Joyce Gold History Tours to present to us When Manhattan Was Dutch. And we love Joyce. We have had wonderful walking tours with Joyce, and we're glad to bring a little bit of that here to you today, virtually, and for those of us in person. Joyce?
Thank you very much. Welcome. I'm glad you're here. Well, New York City history began in the age of exploration. Europeans looking for a route to the riches of the East sailed west. And in the 17th century, the first Europeans to settle in the present New York City began to give the island of Manhattan much of its present character. Let's see what that's about. The first explorer to come was Henry Hudson. And he was an Englishman who twice had, working for an English company, tried to get to the riches of the East by going north over Russia. North over Russia, at around the White Sea up there, it was very icy. His men seemed to have threatened that they would revolt. So he turns back. He never did that. Then he's hired by the Dutch East India Company to find a route to the east. They seem to have thought that Ohio was going to be the Sea of Japan, so they didn't have their distances very much together. And Hudson had heard about going west because the explorer John Smith had gone into Virginia in 1607 and had informed a lot of the other European explorers, I think there might be a way to get to the Orient a little bit north of here. So in 1624, Henry Hudson goes west and comes to Manhattan. Here he is. He was in a boat with some men, and they claimed the place for the Dutch. He is on his way back to the Netherlands to report his findings, but he stops off in England, his home country, to let them know and to get some more supplies. And they say to him, "You're English. We don't want you working for the Dutch. We're now going to hire you to go even north of where you went when you went for the Dutch." But in the bay, now named for him, Hudson's Bay in Canada, he was truly mutinied against. And he, his young son, and some of the people on his side were last seen in the icy wastelands of Canada. And so in his goal to find a route to the Spice Islands, that's what they were called, he ends up dying in the process. Now, the Dutch were very canny. Oh, this is an interesting ship, the remains of a ship. The Dutch were very canny business people. And they really didn't want to put down a colony based on what an English explorer, even if they had hired the explorer, had reported back. What had he reported back? He said, there are lots of fur-bearing animals here, and that was the focus of the Dutch West India Company. The Dutch East India Company actually had paid for his travels. The Dutch West India Company is going to be started in 1621, and they are the people above the governor for the 40 years that New Amsterdam existed. So what did the Dutch do, as good businessmen often would? They wanted to check what Hudson had told them. So they hire a Dutch explorer, Adrian Block, and he goes to America, goes to Manhattan, and a terrible thing happens to him. He came in a ship that wasn't very long, and you are seeing the remains, they think, of that ship. It was called the Tiger. What was so terrible about it? It burned in Manhattan. The seagoing vessel disappears. So he and his sailors were so intrepid, they spend the winter in I think it would be around 50 Broadway today, and rebuild a 44-foot long seagoing vessel. called the onrust, the restless. In the early 20th century, I think it was for the PATH train downtown, they were excavating and came upon this remnant. They think it's of the ship that burned, and it's now in the proud possession of the Museum of the City of New York. On his way back, apparently he was the first European to be in Long Island Sound. He discovers, that's a word we don't use about things that had had Native Americans for thousands of years there already. He discovers an island off Rhode Island, and it's still called Block Island after Adrian Block. So this is a map of who owned what in the eastern part of Manhattan, of the United States. The blue is English. So you see New England and the very large Virginia colony. The yellow is New Sweden, basically Delaware today. And the pink is New Netherlands. The province was New Netherlands. The city in the lower part of Manhattan, of course, was New Amsterdam. And that was there for 40 years, at which point the blue is going to close and it will all be British until the end of the American Revolution. The Dutch were here for 2 years, and they decided in a very European way to purchase the island. It might have been to just show the British that they had a right to this land. And so Peter Minuit, a Huguenot governor of New Amsterdam, is exchanging goods for land with a member of the Canarsie Indians. Canarsie Indians were headquartered in the Canarsie section of Brooklyn, and they changed 60 guilders worth of goods for Manhattan Island, often considered a hilarious, incredible transaction. Somebody in many years later decided 60 guilders in 1626 was the equivalent of $24, giving rise to the 19th century song, "Give It Back to the Indians." You know, this is considered a hilarious deal. But if you think that a good contract is one to which both sides agree, it was a bad contract. To the Europeans, a very ordinary transaction. You exchange value, you get land, and then it's yours. The Indians, however, did not have the concept of private ownership of nature. How could you think you own the wind or the sky or land? They weren't that numerous. They say perhaps 10,000 natives were in Manhattan at this period. But if the hunting was good, they would go one place. There was enough room for them to move around. And so they didn't have this concept. And this was really a horrible clash of cultures. In the 1640s, a native woman sees a ripe peach in a Dutchman's orchard. She picks it. With his European concept, she was trespassing on private land. She was stealing private property. He felt within his right to kill her for what she had done. And the Indians, with their tribal sense of justice, don't look to see the farmer who killed the woman, but they attack the whites. And the whites at that point use that as a reason to attack and kill many, many Indians. So the clash of cultures, was not easy. The natives were very helpful in some ways to the settlers. They taught them how to trap beaver, for example, and increasingly the beaver, well, as soon as the Europeans come to New Amsterdam, they change the nature. The first 6 years they were here, they send 63,000 beaver and otter pelts back to Europe. So what was all that about? By the way, this is a photograph of the exact letter that one of the men on the Dutch side sent back to The Hague. I think it's in their possession today, sometimes I guess on loan, that itemizes what all they traded for the island of Manhattan. It included otter fur and beaver fur and oak and hickory wood, because that was one of the things also that you might be surprised to know that our lumber in this island was also very useful for the Dutch. They had 2,300 ships, more than anybody in the world at that time in their golden age. And the European knives were too soft to be able to fell these hardwood trees. And the Indians showed them how you could put a rock on a stick and that would help you do that. So these were all products that were first sent back to Europe from Manhattan Island. Well, the beaver, we have a beaver right up there, very appropriate. And this was the reason the Dutch were here. I'm going to tell you later why the Dutch gave up Manhattan. That's a very interesting story too. What was so important about the beaver? Well, in those days, men in Europe tended to wear hats like this, felt hats made from the short hair of the beaver. Russia had something of a monopoly on beaver skin at the time, and they provided the fur to many of the felt makers, because felt is made from the short hair of the beaver. And the Dutch realized we're going to break their monopoly when we can import all of this from Manhattan Island and then beyond. Because as they start being very efficient about killing beaver, going after the beaver began to be further and further outside of Manhattan. Oops, sorry about that. Let's see, I don't want to miss anything. Here we go. Sorry. What you're looking at here is the first picture we know of Manhattan Island. South is on the right. And first of all, why did the Dutch settle at the southern tip of this 12.5-mile long island? Well, largely they were looking to the Narrows to see if British ships were coming in. The British and the Dutch were at war sometimes. Sometimes they had peace. And so they were a little afraid of the Europeans, of the British coming through. So one of the things this begins, aside from the money orientation of the island, the Dutch were here to make money, and it's always had a lot of New York's character right in that. But in this picture, you can see that the line of settlement, only as more people came to town, did the line of settlement move up the island. By 1660s, people pretty much lived south of the present Wall Street. By the end of the American Revolution, they lived pretty much south of Canal Street, but it all begins here. You can see our skyline, it's a windmill. We had a couple of different windmills, and you can see that beautiful fort called Fort Amsterdam. And there was a fort on that site until at the end of the American Revolution, it was called Fort George and was finally demolished. But that was the fort. And the person who drew this also was the person responsible for designing the fort. His name was Kryn Fredericks, and I do not have any knowledge of the Dutch language, so I don't know how I'm supposed to pronounce what I'm reading, but Kryn Fredericks, and they think maybe the fort didn't look quite that good because he was both drawing it and responsible for it. So that's a good thing to know. And you know that the Indians here are in and out of the place. Amsterdam in the Netherlands was booming. This was a time of all kinds of religious wars in many different countries. And there was tolerance, which I'll get into a little bit more in the Netherlands. Was it the Netherlands yet? I'm not sure. Sorry. Primarily in what? The 7 provinces of 1581. That come in after they declare their independence from Spain. So a lot of Dutch people didn't come. I mean, many of your ancestors came during this period, but money was booming in the Netherlands, and so a lot of the Dutch didn't come. But all of those people were streaming from all over Europe into Amsterdam. The Huguenots, who were Protestants who were no longer able to pray freely in Catholic Spain, went to the Netherlands. The Puritans from England went to the Netherlands before they went to New England. Jews who had been expelled from Spain and Portugal went to Amsterdam. So the people who came to the neighborhood at that time, some of them were Dutch, but many of them were from diverse backgrounds. So that's another thing that begins in the Dutch period, incredible diversity. The population of New Amsterdam was much more diverse than the population of Boston or Philadelphia, founded by the English. If you were of the wrong kind of religion, you might have trouble. But in New Netherlands, where people were here to get ahead, still very much how immigrants come to New York today, they would tolerate you. They didn't necessarily love you, but in general, they tolerated you. And no other country in Europe was doing that at the time. This map shows you that it was quite a narrower island in those days. The rest of it is now landfill. On the east side, Pearl Street, still called Pearl Street, was the edge of the East River. And it had that name because there were a lot of oysters in the seas, in the waters around Manhattan. These were not the kind of oysters that had pearls, but their mother of pearl oyster shells were left along the water. People walked over them, they had a pearly look. Water Street, Front Street, and South Street were added out of landfill by 1810. And on the west side, basically Greenwich Street, which was the route to Greenwich Village, was the western edge, and they added a few more blocks after that, even into the 20th century, when the World Trade Center was largely built on landfill. But not to worry, it went down to the bedrock, even under the water, so it was pretty firm. But this was New Amsterdam. People often had vegetable gardens behind their homes, but that wasn't really the main supply of food in New Amsterdam. They came on the first ships with barnyard animals so that they had cows and milk and all of that. But that wasn't primarily where they got their food. Physically, the streets. When the Dutch came to Manhattan, they found there was a little inlet of water up the island at the southern end. Well, they were used to getting around the cities of the Netherlands by boats on canals, so they extended the canal up the island a few blocks. This, if you know New York, is not Canal Street. That comes about by 1820, but this was the canal downtown. And there was a bridge across it at the southern end. Then the next block up was the first paved street in town. And the next block up from on the canal was the weekly market. And the next block up was another canal that went into the main canal where they caught beaver. So that was the original layout of the place. This is a look, not original from the times, but just an evocation of what it might look like. You're looking up Broadway. Broadway, if you've ever gone to Broadway, whether in the financial district or the theater district or even to the north, you are often going up a little hill. That tells you that Broadway is topographically a different form from the land around it. It's a 500 million year old vein of something called inwood marble. And that's what it is. It was for the Indians, it was sort of an elevated place. And the runners among the Indians, I think from Dobbs Ferry, used to run on Broadway to get into Manhattan Island. Here you can see on the left, there's a small graveyard behind one of the houses. And if you look up Broadway, you can see a little sentry box, because in 1653, they built a wall from river to river to defend against a potential land invasion by the English. And they had sentries. They had a land gate, which is what you're looking at. And then to the east, this is the wall. It was up from 1653 until 1699, at which point it was demolished because it was inhibiting the growth that was always Manhattan. It was about 9 foot of logs above ground, about 3 foot of logs below ground. And of course, that is Wall Street today. That's where the name comes from. Here is the Water Gate at the eastern edge. The English never came by land, however. Some people think the wall was put up to keep the Indians out, but in 1653, Cromwell was in charge of England and making warlike noises against the Dutch Republic. And that's the year, therefore, that they erect the wall to defend against the English. Wonderful subway mosaics. We get a subway in 1904 in New York. Today we have over 700 miles of subway track, but the first stations sometimes have fabulous mosaics still nicely standing there that have to do with the history of the stop. So that on the 4, 5, and 6 subway lines, the Wall Street stop station has this wonderful mosaic of the stepped roof of a Dutch house in what was New Amsterdam. Here's another view. Now you can see there's the fort. Now the left is south, and you see the fort, and that's Broadway in front of the fort. It was the widest street in New Amsterdam. Then to the right of it, you see the canal with the bridge and the other things I mentioned. Now, finally, when the English come in, they don't have a history particularly of canals, and they looked at this and said, what a wonderful place to throw our garbage. So by 1676, it was really an open sewer and gets filled in, and that made that the second broadest street downtown, and it's today called Broad Street. So now you know. Where the bridge was is now called Bridge Street. The first paved street is now called Stone Street. The weekly market is called Marketfield Street, and the canal is called Beaver Street. And I think you now know more than 95% of the people that work there. They know the names. They have no idea of what I just told you. And that's Perelstraat on the south, on the bottom of it all. Narrow canyons of Wall Street, that's what it's famous for. And it does have narrow canyons because the bedrock is near the surface. So zoning, ever since 1916, has allowed very high buildings, and the streets were laid out by the Dutch in the early 1600s. So it's a very current view. Much of it, in so many ways, much of New York is currently is what the Dutch brought to the play at the time. So not everything in Dutch times was south of the wall. Because of certain connections just above the wall, in what is now the section called Tribeca, was one estate. Anneke Jans owned it, and it was the subject of the longest litigation in the history of New York, because it eventually becomes the property of the Crown of England when England takes over. But one of the descendants of Anneke Jans, some of you may be her descendants, in fact, in the room, didn't sign a release saying that she didn't have any ownership of this. And for possibly 100 years, lawyers would go to the descendants and say, do you know you own some of Trinity Church's vast property? Let's put in a contingency in your lawsuit. And I think it was in the 1920s that a judge finally said, okay, everybody suing gets $1, and that's the end of the lawsuit. But this was one of the things that was north of New Amsterdam. Now, perhaps you know people who live between 67th Street and 76th Street, east of 3rd Avenue. That was where the slaves of the Dutch West India Company were housed. And they were brought over 2 years after the Dutch arrived. They were brought over in 1626. So it was all part of the mix of the different people who were here. Harlem, that's where most of the food came from for New Amsterdam. It had very fertile land in East Harlem. It's possible, historians don't seem to be clear about it, that it had been agricultural area for the Indians. It was very rich soil, and Peter Stuyvesant, when he was governor, of course, more on him later, said to the farmers, you know, I can't protect you because you might be attacked by natives, you might be attacked by other people, and I just don't have the forces to be up there. So the farmers said, well, what if we put our houses across from one another with the farms opposite, and we will take care of each other. And that is how in 1658, New Harlem, spelled with two A's at the time, comes about. It was rural for a very long time until the end of the 19th century. It took quite a while to get down to where a lot of the work was happening other than farming. But Harlem was also, and here you can see large estates, the map of Harlem showing the lands as in the original lots and farms. So this was a Dutch mainstay for many, many years. Now, Brooklyn, of course, is now part of New York City. That didn't happen until 1898, but you can see that 5 of these names are Dutch. And today, the whole borough is called Brooklyn, but originally only what we would call downtown Brooklyn today was called Brooklyn. And you can see that the flatlands and Vlakbush, that was the Dutch word, and now it's Flatbush. The flatness appealed to the Dutch. By the time they came here, they had saved 180,000 acres from the sea in the Netherlands. So they were very adept at dealing with different kinds of terrains. The one here that was not Dutch was Gravesend at the southern tip. That's where Brighton Beach and Coney Island are today. But that was started by a woman, and an aristocratic woman, who differed from some of the other people in Boston and basically had to get out of town. And Lady Deborah Moody, but everything else was Dutch in the Dutch period. And it stayed as a farm community for a long time. That also was a good source of food for the Dutch. What you're looking at here is the oldest extant building in the 5 boroughs of New York today. It's the Peter Clausen Wyckoff House in Brooklyn. And you related?
Now we have a picture.
Oh, same picture? I don't think it's all there. I think some of it has disappeared, but they think 1651, so that would have been built during the Dutch period. I can tell you that in Manhattan by 1776, we had 25,000 population, and we had been a city for a century and a half, but no buildings from the Dutch period remain in Manhattan from that time. In fact, only 3 buildings that were in Manhattan in 1776 are still standing. But in Brooklyn, this was from 1651. This is the Wurlitzer House. It's considered the oldest schoolhouse left in America, and it wasn't from the Dutch period, it was from the 1690s, but I include it here because it really helps me tell you a little bit about education among the Dutch. It was a big priority and very different from the English. They treated girls and boys the same. They had the same education until at a certain age, their education diverged, but it was a very important thing. And people, sometimes they send children from quite a distance to New Amsterdam to study. Here is a picture from the south. Again, you see the windmill, and you're looking at the fort. It's called Fort Amsterdam. And behind it is the only church that was permitted in town during the Dutch period. It's not that such a diverse population and other people could pray, but in their houses, they didn't want it kind of visible, except if you were Dutch Reformed. So that's what this is. The Dutch Reformed Church has 4 descendants in Manhattan today. Activities, ice skating, very popular in the time, much more popular than in the icier Boston, because England didn't have such a tradition of ice skating. So that was very popular. After the Dutch period, it sort of goes out of popularity until the creation of Central Park in the 1850s. And when that was started, more people went to Central Park in the winter to skate and sled than they did in the summer, all those little scrawny trees that hadn't had a chance to grow yet. This is an interesting image, I think, also. You're looking at the front door of St. Patrick's Cathedral on 50th Street and Fifth Avenue. And the person represented was a Roman Catholic minister, missionary. You may notice he's missing a couple of fingers because he tried to convert Indians upstate during the Dutch period, and they cut off his fingers, and eventually he goes back and they kill him, which is why, as a martyr of the Catholic Church, he rates being on the front door of St. Patrick's, but he's the guy often quoted about the diversity of New Amsterdam. In 1643, he comes to the island of Manhattan, and he relates that they say 18 languages. I mean, the population was maybe 400 people. 18 languages were already spoken on Manhattan Island, and I'm sure it was far more than that because the Africans had more than one language that they didn't particularly notice. The Indians mostly spoke Algonquin, but maybe more as well. But Father Jogues. Native Americans, this is a photograph I took at the Natural History Museum, and they have quite interesting information about the pre-colonists. Africans came, and there was a slave market along the East River on the present Wall Street where they were sold. Not a very good part of our history, but some of them were given at least half freedom in the Dutch period. What you're looking at here is a picture or a map of Western Greenwich Village. The green line is today Christopher Street. It was a sandbar. And then the blue line is a stream. They used to catch a lot of trout there. It was called Minetta Water. And today you can see Minetta Street and Minetta Lane in Greenwich Village. The water is now underground. But in 1644, some of the first Blacks that were brought to Manhattan were given freedom for themselves, not their children, however. That's what half freedom meant. And they have names like Simon Congo. They figured that's the part of Africa from which he had been taken. Paulo d'Angola, Anthony Portuguese. And they were given this freedom, but they were required to farm. And as something of a tax or a payment, they were expected to give some of what they produced to the city below. And the Dutch seem not to have thought of the Blacks as kind of lower people, which the English did much more, but they were very useful in a commercial place to be doing jobs that the whites didn't want to do. And Greenwich Village had a very long Black history, even into the beginning of the 20th century, certain sections of it. Quakers were in Flushing, Queens. And the governor before Peter Stuyvesant, Willem Kieft, said that people could pray. They wouldn't, if they weren't really public about it, they would be able to pray in whatever religion they had. But when Stuyvesant came in, the law and order governor, Kieft attacked a lot of Indians, and the problem for the Dutch was you attack Indians, they attack back. And this is very bad for the life of the colony. And Stuyvesant thought there was only one good way to get to heaven, and that was to be Dutch reformed. He physically almost beats to death a Quaker. If his sister hadn't stopped him, he would have killed the guy because he thought they were leading people astray. So he decides, he sends to the house of John Bown in Flushing. Easy to know where the house is still. It's at the corner of John and Bown Street. So that's not hard. But they sent him, they sent the soldiers to stop him from doing that. And some of the other people who lived in Flushing, Queens, Vlissingen, I guess, was the Dutch word for that, the name for it at the time. They wrote a remonstrance to Stuyvesant saying they should have the right to be able to pray freely. And this Flushing Remonstrance, very important document, and said to have been an important precedent in the American Constitution, the freedom of religion clause, the First Amendment in the Bill of Rights. This is the Bown House, and you can visit it. And they had so many offspring that the first thing they say when you go in, they say, "Are you related?" So a lot of people apparently still are. Here was a facsimile of the kitchen in the Bown House, from which John Bown was removed by the soldiers for allowing people to pray in his house, but then they let him out. The Huguenots, again, New Rochelle, north of the city, was the main enclave, for the Huguenots. And there was a church at the very southern tip of the island that is long gone, but there you have part of the mix, the ethnic mix and the religious mix of New Amsterdam. Now, the first Jewish people come to Manhattan in 1654, and they come from the last place many people would expect. They came from Brazil. This was the golden age of the Dutch Republic. They had all of those ships. They were all over the map. In about a 35-year period, they started settlements that later became Jakarta, Indonesia, Cape Town, South Africa, Recife, Brazil, Curacao, and New York. So northern Brazil, Pernambuco, was Portuguese, but then the Dutch took it. And the Dutch allowed Jewish people to be there. So in population of 1,800 people in 1654, half of them were Jewish. Well, Portugal, in the age of the Spanish Inquisition, the Portuguese Inquisition, they'd kill you if you were Jewish, if you didn't at least seem to convert to Catholicism. They allowed the Jewish people to leave. And they all get on 16 ships to go back to the Netherlands. 15 of the ships make it. For one of the ships that had 23 men, women, and children on it, they were in a horrible gale in the Caribbean for 10 days. They land in Havana, where they're very suspicious of any foreigners, and they're jailed for a while. And 7 months after they leave Brazil, the captain of the second ship they're on leaves them at the nearest Dutch port, and that was New Amsterdam. Well, you can imagine what Stuyvesant said. He said, "We have too many kinds of Christians here. We certainly don't need Jews." But the people here were very accepting of the incoming people. And I'll tell you how I know that, because the captain wanted the few things that these people had saved in the last 7 months to be auctioned off at the dock in New Amsterdam to pay passage. And people refused to bid against one another in order not to give him much money. So how did Stuyvesant, how was he forced to allow them to remain? Just 23 people. The Dutch West India Company, people were always going over Stuyvesant's head to the 19 men of the Dutch West India Company in Europe. And a number of the investors in the Dutch West India Company were Jewish. The company was not in a position to make them upset. And so Stuyvesant was told they must be allowed to stay. But he kept putting restrictions on them. For example, in 1653, when they were building this palisade, this wall on Wall Street, he said every grown man has to guard the wall, except if they were Jewish. And then there was a Jew tax. Well, they protest. Asser Levy was the main Jewish guy who seems to have been in almost everything in this period. And the Dutch West India Company tells Stuyvesant they have to be able to guard the wall. Stuyvesant said, well, they can't own a house. he was told they have to. The merchants did the same thing. In 1653, they approached the Dutch West India Company and they said what they wanted to hear the most. They said, we're making money for you and we are tired of being ordered around by Peter Stuyvesant. So give us some say. And that is the origin of the prototype of our city council. It wasn't just one person dictating everything. So in the square downtown named for Peter Minuit, this is a plaque that says the state of New York to honor the memory of the 23 men, women, and children who landed in September of 1654. Now, all through the 40 Dutch years and the 119 years we were a British colony, there were never more than 200 or so Jewish people in the town, but this is when it all started. This is Stone Street downtown. It's still, these buildings are after the Dutch period. They're basically from the 1840s, but the scale sort of evokes when that was a Jewish ghetto. And we're not exactly sure why the Jews lived there. Were they forced to by the Dutch, unlikely, or by the English, or did they just feel safer in a somewhat alien area to have to if they did it on their own, or if there was some rule that said they had to, so they're not too sure. The first synagogue in North America is going to open in that area, but it was in 1730. So there was no synagogue in Northern America until the beginning of the English time, and not only at the very beginning either. So let's see. Well, who was in charge here? It was the Dutch West India Company. There was one port, one dock, and you can see it there. But at the head of the dock, it looks like a little bungalow. That was the custom house of the Dutch West India Company. If you imported goods, you better pay the tax to them. And so they were in charge. But this kind of interesting picture helps show you the dangers. Fire was always a danger in New York. And here they are running. I mean, people cooked with fire, they heated with fire. It was always a big danger. Flag of the Dutch West India Company. Today's flag of the city of New York. We get a flag of our own in the 1890s. And here's what's on it. That's a native person on the right, and the man at the left is a mariner. The sea was always very important to New York's history. He's holding something, not a Christian cross. It's actually a nautical implement to help you know where on the high seas you are. And the flour barrel, and we're about money. The beaver is in the middle of our flag, and we're proud of it too. And our second big monopoly we got had to do in the actually 1670s. They said that any wheat grown in the state of New York, because of quality control, could be made into flour only in Manhattan. Took a while to get that rescinded. They screamed about it upstate. Cute little peg leg Pete, that's not who he was at all. His previous job had been protecting the Dutch interests in Curacao. He lost a leg in Curacao when they blew it off, so peg leg was what he had on his extremities. And he kept fighting, even though his leg was blown off. So after the Indians started attacking back under the previous administration, they bring in Stuyvesant. I feel kind of close to him here. It's the only portrait for which he actually sat. And this is in the collection of the New York Historical Society. When you came into the river coming into New Amsterdam, was there a big welcome to New Amsterdam sign? No. There was the stocks, the gibbets. You got to watch your step. That's the kind of town they said they were. This was the city tavern that becomes the city hall. This is Stuyvesant's city house. He had two houses, one in the city and one in his huge estate from 23rd Street to about 34th Street, up a bit. And this was just a little house painted white. When the English come in, that was at a time in 1664 when the King of England lived in a palace called Whitehall. And the British captain coming in, looking at this dinky building, said, "Oh, how impressive. It looks just like Whitehall." And that is now the name of the street. And the subway stop, that's Peter Stuyvesant's city house in the mosaic tile at Whitehall Street. Well, the English do come in, and they do come in by water. I don't know why this keeps doing this. They come in by water, and they say to New Amsterdam, you have a choice. You can surrender, you'll hardly notice the difference. Official ceremonies will now be in the English language, not Dutch. You might have to pledge your allegiance to the brother of the King of England, James, Duke of York and Albany. But you hardly notice a difference. If you hold land, you can keep it. But if you try to resist us, we will demolish you with our cannon. Stuyvesant says we will fight to the death. Everybody else said, you must be kidding. And so, without firing a shot, they come in and rule for 119 years, except for one, which I will tell you about. Here is the 1911 bust of Stuyvesant, looking like the tough guy he was. He would do things like he wanted people to donate money for a particular project he had in mind. He threw a big party, got everybody drunk, and then made them stick to what they said when they were drunk. They were getting it. So he was a very canny person. And this was given to St. Mark's in the Bowery at 10th Street and 2nd Avenue, where Stuyvesant is buried. He was buried there in 1672. And this was given by Queen Christina. Is that her name of 1911? I should have checked. Huh?
Wilhelmina.
1911? Wilhelmina? Okay. Given by the Queen of the Netherlands to the church. And here is the stone in the eastern wall, outside wall of St. Mark's in the Bowery. This is the vault. Here in the vault lies the body of the late Petrus Stuyvesant. So he is actually buried there. It's the oldest grave known in Manhattan. So he had a country house. I mentioned he owned a lot of property in a bit in what is now the East Village. And on the site of the present St. Mark's Church, which is an Episcopalian church, the reason St. Mark's was there is that a descendant of Stuyvesant, after the American Revolution, said, we will give this land and money to build a church to any denomination if they would only keep up the grave of Peter Stuyvesant. And the Episcopalians raised their hands, and that's how St. Mark's Church was built. It was started in 1799, but that was his property, and he even laid out some streets. He had the slaves of the Dutch West India Company build a road to his farm. And in Dutch, farm is Bowery, and that's the start of the Bowery. So here I've colored it yellow. That is the street they laid out to his area. And there is one street named Stuyvesant Street. They had planned to have, I think, 3 or 4 in one direction with the first names of the men of the Stuyvesant family, and 3 or 4 in the opposite direction, the first names of the women of the Stuyvesant family. But there was only one that was actually done and has been kept. And a lot of people say, oh yes, Stuyvesant Street, that's the angled street in the East Village. It goes from 3rd Avenue and 9th Street to 2nd Avenue and 10th Street, leading to the church. If they said that, they would be 100% wrong, because Stuyvesant Street is due east-west. It was laid out by a compass. Every other street is not straight street. It's simply, Manhattan is at a 29-degree angle. So 14th Street merely the shortest route from the East River to the Hudson, but it's angled. Stuyvesant Street is not. His great-grandson in the 1890s built this beautiful house. So Stuyvesant Street still is much more elegant and much better architecture than the rest of the East Village. The rest of it was largely built for immigrants, but this was not, the street was not. This is one of the descendants of the church in the fort. This is the most famous one. It's the 29th and 5th Avenue. It's marble collegiate. And the word collegiate doesn't have to do with a university or a college. It's the same use of the word as in the Vatican College of Cardinals. It means colleagues. And the Dutch church shared their ministers. So that's why it's called the Collegiate Church. Marble Collegiate Church, famous for a lot of people because of 50 years, their minister was the very famous Norman Vincent Peale. And it has a plaque on it that the others had. Unique for the city, Reformed Protestant Dutch Church in the city of New York, organized under Peter Minuit, director of the New Netherlands in 1628, chartered by William, King of England. That, of course, is William of Orange, who was the head of the Netherlands and then marries the second daughter of James and William and Mary. So this is that. Now, there was one beautiful 1890s church at 2nd Avenue and 7th Street, had the same plaque, but about 2 years ago, they had a horrible fire that demolished the church. I think they may have saved some of the Tiffany windows. I happened to pass that corner about 2 days ago. It's still an empty lot. They saved some of the items from it, but around the corner on 7th Street, they have a kind of a temporary use. So the church is going on, and they have vowed to rebuild that collegiate church. Now at 77th Street and Amsterdam Avenue, fairly near where we are sitting today, this is an 1850s West End collegiate church. And the look of it, they're very interested in their heritage. It's modeled after, I think, the Town Hall of The Hague, but that is one of the collegiate churches as well. And here is a millstone from the mill. Stuyvesant signed the surrender in a mill on what is now called Mill Lane downtown. And they had it in the wall that in this period, I think I took this about 20 or 30 years ago, there was the church at one side on the west side of this, and on the east side was the oldest school in America, collegiate school. They say founded in 1626. Was part of this complex, but about maybe 3 years ago or so, Collegiate moved to a beautiful, huge new building in the West 60s, but still going strong. Collegiate Church, it was started as a church for Indians, I believe, as a school for Indians. And then it was for girls and boys. And now it's one of the best boys' schools. You tell somebody who goes there, you look very happy about Collegiate. It's considered one of the best private schools in the United States. So here are some names that are left over from the Dutch times. And sometimes we find out more information. Now in sorry, what am I doing here? That's right. In 1991, Goldman Sachs was about to build its new world headquarters on a very historical site. It was the site, not even touching it. It was a site that, oh, did I put it on automatic? I don't know.
Technical difficulties.
The site that had great historical potential, thank you, Sarah, because it had been the site of the Dutch City Hall and of a tavern behind the City Hall and the well behind the tavern. And they gave archaeologists a year to analyze that site. And that was one reason it had great historical potential. But another reason was that there had never been a tall building on that site, which meant never a deep basement, which meant there could be artifacts left. And they had a year to look into this. It was called the State House Dig of, it says 1979 is when they started it. So they looked and they found things like pipes. Apparently, the earlier the pipe, the wider the mouth, the stem, and they found oyster shells in the cistern that were so big you had to eat them in 3 pieces. The oysters were very lush. And they found not very good pottery, but it was local clay, which told the archaeologists that we had already started a pottery industry in New York. So it was very good. And they allowed Goldman to, this was even the foundation of the Lovelace Tavern. They allowed Goldman to hold up, you can imagine how expensive it is to hold up construction for a year, but they rewarded Goldman because the city sometimes, if you give something to the public, we'll give something to you. And Goldman wanted to build higher, as most developers and builders want to, but it's right out front. And as you go, oh, here comes the bulldozers. If they hadn't found it, they're never going to find it. By the way, that's Francis Tavern on the right to give you your bearings. But they did it outside. Goldman, since 9/11, has been in a new headquarters just above ground zero. In front of the entrance to that building is a plaque, "You are here." And the crosshatch shows you the Broad Street Canal and the other canal that's now Beaver Street. So did I tell you yet what the first Stone Street? Stone Street is the first paved street. The next one was Marketfield Street, where the market was, and so on. So that's also left from the Dutch time. And this is a wonderful view of all 319 buildings in New Amsterdam in 1660. It's in Peter Minuit field. So 1664, as I mentioned, without firing a shot, the British come in and take over. This is a picture of the Duke of York and Albany in 1885. He becomes James II of England. And the English take the colony in 1667. What did the Dutch give up? They gave up New Amsterdam. And what did they get in exchange, which they preferred at that time, because they hadn't been making the money on Manhattan as they had hoped? They received Suriname along the Atlantic coast, just above Brazil. But then, what a surprise, the Dutch come up the river. And nobody expects them to come up. This was July of 1673. They reoccupy New York City. They had 21 ships, and they renamed the place New Orange. Just over a year, for about a year and 4 months, they were in charge again. And then the English come in and take it back. In November of 1674, they negotiated the Treaty of Westminster, and the Dutch transferred the sovereignty back to England. And they got in exchange 2 important areas that they, at that time, preferred to owning Manhattan and New Netherlands. James again. This, oops. That one of them was the island of Run, R-H-U-N. You see, they got 2 small islands in Indonesia instead of New York. Indonesia has over 17,500 islands. And which 2 did they want? Well, Run, R-H-U-N, tiny, 2 miles by half a mile. That is the size of Roosevelt Island. Why did they prefer that to Manhattan? Well, I will tell you, that was the only place in the world at that time that nutmeg grew. What was so important about nutmeg? Well, it was used as a folk remedy for headaches, stomach issues, and as an aphrodisiac, and also used to balance the humors. It was a central part of medical care. And then just to the north, a slightly larger island called the Maluku, famous for cloves. When you bake, think about your nutmeg and cloves. They exchanged that for where we're sitting. And since the 1st century, cloves were used for medicinal purposes. So that's what they did. They exchanged it for the Spice Islands, losing the access to the Spice Islands. Spice Islands is what started the whole look through. How do we get a Western view to the east? It's what I started talking about this in this trip, and they ended up getting those islands. So I hope I know a lot of you came knowing a lot, and I hope I have added some things to what you know. I hope you enjoyed the tour. Thank you, talk. Thank you very much. Very nice.
Thank you so much, Joyce.
My
And then
pleasure.
for those of you who are online, you can put any questions you have in the question box and we'll read them out and address them. And those of you in the room can raise your hand and we'll address them that way.
Yes, anybody have a question or a comment or a correction? I do appreciate corrections because so much data, I couldn't be right about everything.
There are some the Run Island.
Yes,
Before that,
run.
the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, already owned some islands.
Did they own those two?
Yes, next to the Run Island, the
Oh.
Banda Island.
Uh-huh.
And in 1621, Jan Pieterszoon Koen, he massacred the population of that island. That was in 1621.
Wow.
So, but the British had only that small Run Island in those days, and that was the island that, well, they ruined all the nutmeg trees.
Wow.
So the British didn't want that island anymore because there were no trees left. Because the
I
Dutch,
see.
they only took their own island, the Banda Island. There were the nutmeg trees, and the other islands they just ruined the trees.
Very interesting. Thank you very much. Yeah, it was in contention. What is up and what is down commercially, as you know, changes a lot.
Yeah.
Now, of course, these are grown in many parts of the world, but
Yes.
it was exclusive then. Helpful. Anything else?
Yes, we have some questions on the chat box.
Oh, okay.
What is the location of the first schoolhouse photo that you
The
showed?
first schoolhouse, the Wurlitzer House, that is in Staten Island. In Staten Island, they did something very interesting in Richmond Town Restoration. They brought old buildings from around Staten Island to this one complex that you can visit, and that would be one of them. Yes, why don't we ask
What
you?
about the settlement of Governor's Island?
Governor's Island, okay, in 1624, when the Dutch arrived, that's where they are. And then in 1625, they come to Manhattan. So there's a little contention about when did the whole thing start. I say celebrate both years, why not? Yeah, yes.
I have a question about Governor's Island.
Uh-huh.
There used to be a mill on Governor's Island.
Hmm.
But do you know where the mill was standing?
I don't know. And I've given a lot of tours of Governor's Island, but they're mostly post-American Revolution, so I don't know. Yeah.
Ask you about the diversity and the religious tolerance of New Amsterdam.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned that life was good in the motherland, in the Netherlands itself,
Yes.
and that therefore it may not have been very attractive to go to the colonies and live an uncertain life with a family,
Yeah.
just of trade in beavers or of fur or in a dangerous situation. And may that explain why we had so many nationalities and religions rather
Exactly.
than the perceived religious tolerance that the Dutch seem to have. Or sometimes you hear that, but
That's right.
it may be a matter of money more than anything else.
It could very much be money, but what it was in 1581, the Dutch proclaimed their separation from Spain.
Yeah.
And Spain was very rigid about one religion only. And I think that also, my own feeling is that also might have liberated them about not having to spend your energy and your time making sure that everybody, religious wars get in the way of commerce too. So I think both of those, I think your idea is good as well. Yes, do you have anything else, Sarah?
We have a couple. So someone is curious, they have two ancestors from New Amsterdam buried in a cemetery at the Dutch Reformed Church near Houston Street. Do you know if that cemetery is still there or was it moved to another place?
I don't think it's there because, they weren't sure about diseases in the old age. And also real estate values is also what gets rid of things. But it's not there any longer because I'm in that area a lot, and it would have been moved if they had clout, and the graves could have been thrown in the river if they didn't have clout. So I presume those graves were moved, but I don't know to where.
And then, what reader-friendly sources do you recommend for learning more about what you?
Well, certainly Island at the Center of the World is the main one, and I would suggest that because, you know, Richard Shorto has the advantage of having the newly translated archives that Charles Gehring has been translating. So it's much more accurate than earlier books, I would say.
And we'll put in a plug for those. You can find all of the translations on our website. We have published the translations in books. So those are available on our website for free, and also the website of the New Netherland Institute. So if you're interested in delving into the administrative records of New Netherland, have at it.
Great.
We've got like 40 books.
Excellent.
And then someone is curious, do you know what year St. Nicholas Church left the fort?
I do not. I don't know when it was, if it was when the English came in. I don't know.
And then I think one more from here. Do you know why settlers from Manhattan moved to Long Island? And from Manhattan to Long Island or to Brooklyn to farm?
Well, you weren't really allowed, during the Dutch time, you really weren't allowed to own property north of the wall. The Dutch West India Company made some exceptions of that, but, you know, Long Island, 100-mile Long Island had good soil in many places and much lower prices. Again, prices come into it. So today, known for money orientation, and I think that also brings in creativity. I think today in Queens County, people speak over 200 languages. Almost half of New Yorkers, I think today, speak a different language at home from English. And that's never changed. And I think as soon as you hit the streets of the city, you get the energy of people who've given up everything for a better life. And what happened in the rest of the world helps determine which groups come at a different time. So New York's almost every bit of history. You know, the Irish famine meant that 200,000 Irish people were in New York in 1860. The German Revolution of 1848 meant that 100,000 Germans were in New York at that time. So it's a very interesting, I mean, it's a huge subject. Almost everything, in my modest opinion, is New York history, but especially the Dutch history.
And then we have one more question about maps. So we do have a copy of an early map, the Costello plan, for sale on our website, if you're interested in that. And we can, if you're interested in more, we can direct you, if you email us at info@hollandsociety.org.
Excellent. So a lot of people have been taking my tours and talks, especially this year, this anniversary year and last year. So, you know, I'm always interested in learning more to be able to give them even better. Thank you.
Any other questions from the room?
Thank you. My pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you.